have you ever watched a parent struggle in public and, well, silently judge them? Maybe you saw a child screaming in the aisle of a supermarket, throwing themselves on the floor, and you immediately thought, if that were my child, I wouldn't stand for that.
Or perhaps you've asked yourself a harder question. What if the meltdown you're staring at isn't bad parenting at all, but an invisible disability? What if what looks like chaos is actually a neurological crisis?
Today, we are dissecting a deeply emotional and contentious issue, the conflict between societal judgment and the reality of raising children with special educational needs and disabilities. We're really looking at the friction between the public eye and private struggles.
Right. And the core question we need to address is uncomfortable, but it's entirely necessary. Is society being unfair to parents who are just trying to survive? Or are behavioral expectations and accountability necessary for community standards to actually exist?
I'm here to argue the case for empathy. I believe we are failing these families. We judge them based on neurotypical norms that simply do not apply. And we need to realize that what looks like naughtiness is often a neurological struggle. It's a physiological event that society largely refuses to see.
And I take the opposing view. I am representing the case for accountability. I'd argue that while empathy is absolutely essential, it cannot replace boundaries. Accountability still matters, not just for the comfort of society, but for the future of the children themselves. Because if support dissolves into excuse, we aren't helping these children, we're disabling them further.
Let's get right into the reality of this. I want to start with the concept of the invisible battle. When we look at the source material, it paints a very vivid picture of this disconnect. When we see a child acting out, our brains, which are conditioned by decades of traditional parenting norms, immediately jump to behavior.
Right.
We see a choice. We see a child choosing to scream, choosing to refuse an instruction. But for a parent of a child with autism or ADHD or sensory processing difficulties, that is fundamentally not what is happening.
I understand the distinction you're making there between can't and won't, but my concern is that the line is becoming increasingly blurred.
Well, it's blurred because we don't understand the mechanism. Let's look at the technical side of this for a second. A child screaming in a shop because the fluorescent lights are physically painful. That is a sensory processing disorder. It's not a dislike, it's a neurological inability to filter input. Or consider a change in routine, triggering a fight or flight response.
Yes.
That isn't disrespect. That is an amygdala hijack. The child's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic and choice, has essentially gone offline. Yet, the public reaction is almost always a glare, a whisper, or that really heavy silence that just screams, "Control your child."
Look, I don't deny that those physiological triggers are real. The science on sensory overload is incredibly clear. However, I worry that we are conflating understanding the cause with accepting the outcome. Understanding why a child is screaming doesn't change the fact that they are screaming in a public library or a restaurant.
But consider the parent in that moment. They aren't just dealing with the child. They are dealing with the weight of every single stare in that room. The material points out that most of these parents are exhausted, and not just tired, but systemically exhausted.
I'm sure they are.
They really are. They're fighting for EHCP support, the Education, Health, and Care Plan, which is notoriously difficult to secure. They're attending endless appointments. They are battling school systems. They are living in a state of chronic stress.
I see that exhaustion, and I respect it. I really do. But I am not convinced by the line of reasoning that exhaustion negates the need for structure. In fact, I'd argue the exact opposite. When a parent is exhausted, that is often when boundaries slip, and that inconsistency can actually exacerbate the anxiety in a neurodivergent child.
It's not about negating structure, though. It's about the fact that society sees a 5-minute meltdown and judges it entirely in a vacuum. They don't see the 5 years of occupational therapy behind it. They don't see that the parent is actively managing a crisis, not failing to discipline a brat. These parents are surviving. When society judges them, it isn't upholding standards. It's adding a layer of trauma to an already incredibly difficult job.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that survival mode is a sustainable strategy for a child's future. That is where my concern lies. I argue that having a child with additional needs, while incredibly challenging, does not eliminate the importance of boundaries. The source material is quite clear on this. Empathy is essential, yes, but we must be careful not to remove all responsibility from parenting. If we treat survival as the permanent state, we completely deny the child the chance to learn adaptation.
Responsibility is a very loaded word here. Responsibility implies the parent has the power to simply switch off the behavior. You seem to be suggesting they are choosing not to?
Neurological differences exist, but not every disruptive action is unavoidable. Not every meltdown is completely beyond influence. If we start from the premise that nothing can be done, we stifle the child. My argument, the argument for accountability, is based on shared standards. We live in a community. Schools need to function. Public spaces require reasonable behavior expectations. If we abandon those, the social contract basically breaks down.
Reasonable for whom? That's the crux of it. You're talking about a social contract written by neurotypical people for neurotypical people.
Reasonable for the collective. If we shield all behavior from scrutiny under the label of special needs, we risk lowering expectations unnecessarily. This is the soft bigotry of low expectations. We risk preventing children from developing necessary coping skills. I mean, if a child is never told no or never learns that certain behaviors have social consequences, how do they develop resilience?
But
Let me just finish this thought. Support and accountability are not opposites. They have to coexist. If we remove the guardrails of social expectation, we aren't being kind. We are failing to prepare that child for the real world, because the real world will not care about their sensory processing disorder when they are 25 and trying to hold down a job.
that brings us directly to the first core theme of our debate, the public meltdown, and the tension between explanation and excuse. You are asking for guardrails, but I am telling you that for many of these families, the guardrails feel like prison bars. When a stranger offers unsolicited advice in a supermarket, which the material notes happens constantly, they are assuming the parent isn't trying. They assume a deficit of effort rather than a surplus of challenge.
Unsolicited advice is rarely helpful, I grant you that. Have you tried a sticker chart? Is not what a parent needs during a meltdown. But let's look at the underlying principle here. At what point does support become excuse? That is the sharp question we have to ask.
I think that question assumes that the parent is looking for a way out. They aren't. They are looking for a way through. When a parent is managing a sensory meltdown, they are fighting for regulation. They are trying to bring the child's nervous system back to baseline. The stranger, and perhaps your perspective on accountability, interprets that as a need for correction, but you cannot correct a neurological overload. You can only survive it. You don't discipline a seizure, and you shouldn't discipline a sensory meltdown.
That is a compelling argument for the moment of acute crisis. If a child is in fight or flight, logic doesn't work. I concede that. But have you considered the pattern? The source material asks, if we automatically shield all behavior from scrutiny, we risk lowering expectations. I'm not talking about punishing a child for being autistic. I am talking about the danger of a parent or society deciding that because a child is autistic, they are inherently incapable of learning appropriate behavior over time. That is a dangerous, deterministic view.
But who defines appropriate? Is it appropriate to force a child to make eye contact when it causes them physical pain? Is it appropriate to force a child to sit still when their vestibular system is screaming for movement?
We can debate the minutia of eye contact, but let's talk about safety and aggression. Let's talk about screaming in a library. The community defines appropriate. If we say that a disability completely absolves a child from the need to follow instructions or respect other space, we are doing them a massive disservice. Guidance toward independence means teaching a child that even though their brain works differently, they still have to navigate a world that has rules. If we remove the blame, do we also remove the agency?
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. The blame you were talking about is toxic. It makes parents retreat. It isolates families. If a parent is afraid to take their child to the supermarket because they know they will be judged for not enforcing boundaries during a sensory episode, they stop going out. The child loses the opportunity to learn. The judgment causes the lack of exposure. You say they need to learn to navigate the world, but your shared standards are actively chasing them out of it.
And I would counter that if the parent brings the child to the supermarket and allows chaos to reign because they believe he can't help it, the community retreats. It cuts both ways. Inclusion cannot mean the domination of the shared space by the individual with the loudest needs. We see this happening in public spaces where the rights of the many to a peaceful environment become entirely secondary to the needs of the one who is disrupting it.
Which bleeds right into our second theme, the impact on community and schools. You mentioned earlier that schools need to function. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
It is, and this is where the empathy argument hits a mathematical wall. Teachers have a duty of care to 30 children in a room, not just one. The source material raises the issue of the collective environment. Other children deserve safe environments. They deserve a classroom where they can learn without constant disruption, without chairs being thrown, without constant screaming.
I absolutely agree that every child deserves to learn. But the friction here isn't usually that parents demand chaos. It's the assumption problem. The advocacy position is that schools and other parents often assume poor parenting before they investigate needs. We see this in the data regarding exclusions. Children with unrecognized special educational needs and disabilities are disproportionately excluded.
Can you clarify exactly what you mean by that assumption?
Certainly. A child acts out in class. Maybe they refuse to sit still or they shout out. The immediate reaction from the system is almost always disciplinary. Detention, isolation, behavioral charts. The assumption is this child needs to learn respect. But if that child has undiagnosed ADHD or sensory processing issues, those disciplinary measures are not just ineffective, they are actively damaging. You are punishing a child for a deficit in executive function. The parent isn't saying, let my kid do whatever they want. The parent is saying, your standard method of discipline is hurting my child because you haven't bothered to understand their neurology.
That is a fair critique of rigid systems. Zero-tolerance policies often lack nuance, I agree. But I must push back on the broader implication here. Are schools equipped enough to judge fairly? Perhaps not always. But are we suggesting that because a child is neurodiverse, they cannot be expected to conform to any neurotypical standards? Because that seems to be the undercurrent of the advocacy argument, that the standard itself is the oppression.
We are asking if the standards are necessary or arbitrary. Sitting cross-legged on a carpet for 30 minutes? Arbitrary. Not hitting another child? Necessary. The problem is that schools often conflate the two. They treat a child wiggling due to proprioceptive needs with the exact same severity as a child being aggressive.
Some rules are arbitrary, sure, but safety isn't. Disruption isn't. If a child throws a chair, that is a safety issue. We cannot say, well, he was overwhelmed, so it's okay. And this is exactly where the invisible disability argument hits a limit. To the child who gets hit by the chair, the reason why it was thrown is completely irrelevant. The impact is the same. The teacher has to protect the class.
No one is saying it's okay. The material explicitly says no serious advocate is arguing for zero boundaries. The real issue is the response. Do you punish the child for the meltdown, or do you adjust the environment so the meltdown doesn't happen in the first place? Do you provide a quiet corner? Do you allow ear defenders? Do you train staff to recognize the precursors before the chair is thrown?
But is it the school's job to fundamentally restructure reality for one child at the expense of the flow of the classroom?
It is the school's job to educate every child. If their environment is hostile to neurodivergent kids, that is a systemic failure, not a child's failure. Inclusion isn't just letting them in the door, it's making sure they can function once they are inside.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it places the entire burden of adaptation on the environment and none on the individual. The world is not going to change its lighting or sound levels for these children when they become adults. If we don't teach them how to cope with a world that isn't designed for them by enforcing some level of expectation, we are setting them up to fail. Support cannot mean allowing chaos that disrupts the learning of others. Resources are finite. A teacher's energy is finite. At some point, the needs of the one cannot outweigh the needs of the 29.
Suggesting that labels like ADHD,
autism, ODD are being used as a shield to deflect criticism.
I am. I think there is a genuine risk of misattribution, as the source material calls it. Not every child who misbehaves has unmet needs. Sometimes a child is just pushing boundaries because that is what children do. It's a normal developmental stage.
And sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Exactly. If we immediately label every act of defiance as sensory overwhelm or executive dysfunction, we stop parenting. We stop teaching, we say it's the condition, and we wash our hands of it. This is what psychologists call diagnostic overshadowing, attributing everything to the diagnosis and missing other factors. Open discussion about parenting shouldn't automatically be labeled as judgment. We need to be able to say, actually, that behavior wasn't a disability response. That was a child testing limits, and you missed an opportunity to correct it.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered the cost of being wrong? The advocate's stance is that the harshness of society comes from a total lack of context. You see a child testing limits. I see a child who has been masking their struggles all day, holding it together at school to fit your shared standards, and finally exploded the moment they felt safe. That's the Coke bottle effect. Shake it all day, take the lid off at home.
But how do we know? That's the core problem. In the moment, how does a teacher or a bystander distinguish between the Coke bottle effect and a tantrum?
We don't. That is exactly the point. That is why judgment is so incredibly dangerous. Because if you treat a meltdown like a tantrum, if you punish a child who is already in severe distress, you traumatize them. You reinforce the idea that their pain doesn't matter. Now, if you treat a tantrum like a meltdown, maybe you spoil them a little. Maybe they get away with something once. I'd argue the former is much worse than the latter. Different does not mean undisciplined. The approach needs adjustment, not just criticism.
I worry that adjustment is becoming a euphemism for lowered standards. The source concept is that support should empower, not excuse. To me, empowerment means giving a child the tools to meet the standard, not lowering the standard until it requires no effort. If we lower the bar to the floor, we aren't helping them jump. We're just letting them walk over it.
And to me, empowerment means validating their reality so they feel safe enough to learn. You can't learn when you're in fight or flight. You can't learn when you're being shamed. You are asking for compliance. I am asking for regulation. They are two very different goals. A compliant child might look good in a classroom, but a regulated child is actually functioning.
But you also can't learn if you're never challenged. There is a concept of scaffolding in education, supporting a child to reach a higher level, but the key is reaching higher. My fear is that the current cultural conversation around invisible disability is removing the ladder entirely. We are so afraid of triggering the child that we stop asking them to climb.
It is a delicate balance, but looking at the source material, the weight of the argument from my side is that parents are already doing the challenging. They are the ones in the therapy sessions. They are the ones doing the grueling work at home. What they encounter in public, the stares, the whispers, the exclusion, it doesn't help them challenge their child. It just isolates them. It makes them feel like the whole world is against them. When a parent feels besieged, they can't parent effectively.
I agree that isolation is the enemy here, but I would argue that shared standards are what actually allow for inclusion. If we want these children to be part of the community, they need to be able to abide by the community's basic social contracts. We can expand the contract, yes, we can make it more understanding, but we cannot shred it.
Or maybe the contract just needs to change. The contract was written before we understood neurodiversity. It was written for a very specific type of brain. And now that we know better, we should do better.
Perhaps. But until it does, we have to live in the world as it is, not as we wish it were. And we have a fundamental duty to prepare children for that reality.
Let's look at where we stand as we wrap this up. We've looked at the emotional toll on parents, the reality of public meltdowns, and the intense friction in schools.
It is clear that this isn't a binary choice between letting them do anything and military discipline. But the tension we've discussed is very real.
From my perspective, the core truth remains. Parents need understanding, not scrutiny. The world is already incredibly difficult for these families. They're navigating systems that are often broken and managing biologies that are complex and invisible. Society shouldn't add to the burden by assuming the worst.
We need to presume competence and presume love. We need to realize that what we see in that 5 minutes at the grocery store is just 1% of that family's reality.
I don't disagree with the need for love, and I certainly don't advocate for cruelty, but I reaffirm that while compassion is vital, so is the responsibility to teach children how to navigate the world. We must protect standards, not to be cruel, but to help children thrive. If we fear judgment so much that we stop holding children accountable, we aren't protecting them. We are disabling them further. We're creating a bubble that will eventually burst.
The friction really comes down to what we see when we look at a struggling family. Do we see a problem to be fixed or a struggle to be supported?
And how we interpret the cause of that struggle. Is it a neurological inevitability or a behavioral opportunity?
Exactly. So, to our listeners, we want to leave you with this thought. The next time you see a parent struggling in a supermarket or a child melting down at the park, will you judge or will you pause?
Is society too harsh, or are we simply afraid to have honest conversations about behavior?
Are we witnessing bad parenting or an invisible battle we know absolutely nothing about?
The answer isn't one or the other. It's in how we choose to respond in the moment.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Thank you.